Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With cases growing above 2.5 million and soaring further ahead, and with India increasing at something like 61, 62,000 a day, the only silver lining to this otherwise black cloud is India's low mortality rate. But how accurately is it calculated? And if it is accurate, what is the explanation? Those are the two core issues I shall discuss today with Professor of Epidemiology from the Public Health Foundation of India in Bangalore, Giridhar Babu. Professor Babu, let's start with the situation facing the country today. As I said in the introduction, we've crossed 2.5, in fact, we've crossed 2.6 million this morning. We're increasing at something like 61, 62 an average every single day. And now we are the fastest growing country in the world. We've overtaken America, we've overtaken Brazil. As an epidemiologist, tell me, is this worrying, or given the size of India's population, 1.3 billion, is this to be expected?
Thanks for having me on the show, Karan. To give in perspective, yes, absolutely, in terms of the number of cases that we are seeing, especially the daily increase in cases, it is concerning. But given the size of India's population, relatively, if you look at cases per million or even deaths per million, as you said earlier, we would have relatively better projections as we move ahead. Well, the only thing as of now which is surprising is China, which is ahead of us. How did they contain in terms of the number of cases? Otherwise, because the China did whatever it did, India appears to be the largest country with the largest number of cases, just because the sheer numbers. And in terms of cases per million and death per million, I think we are okay relatively to other countries which have more than 100,000 cases.
You make a very interesting comparison with China. China contained its problem roughly around 86,000 cases. We've more than tripled that. Is it worrying? I know that in population terms, we're almost as big as China. Is it worrying that we have not been able to contain it? We've exceeded China 3 times, and undoubtedly we'll carry on.
There are two aspects to it, Karan. One is I don't understand how China contained it in the absence of a vaccine. If they are more forthcoming in terms of the strategies that worked in China, which contained the transmission, that will be helpful for the rest of the world. Whereas in terms of India, what is happening is, given that the country is expanding its testing capacity, and also the states are peaking at different types of, temporally. So therefore, we will continue to have these cases, which I feel is going to be the natural progression for any infectious disease, that
Okay.
the cases will have to probably go up. In fact, at least some reasonable portion of the population, after which the cases will have to come down.
In which case, let me pick up on that last point you made. As you say, the cases will have to go up. Look down the road for me over the next 2 months. How many cases do you expect around about Diwali, which I believe is the 14th of November? And let me give some context here for the audience. Brahma Mukherjee from the University of Michigan has told us that by the end of August, India could have 100 million infections altogether. Ramanan Lakshmi Narayan of the Washington-based Center of Disease Dynamics has said by the end of September, we could have 200 million cases altogether. And as you know, MIT has done a projection which says if there's no virus, sorry, I beg your pardon, if there's no vaccine, India could be increasing at 280,000 cases per day. As one of our foremost epidemiologists, let me ask you a simple question. What do you believe will be the number of cases 2 months from today when we celebrate Diwali?
There are a lot of projections, a lot of estimations. Some are alarming, some are very conservative. But based on the exact number of cases that we have, and looking at how we are progressing, we might be reaching maybe roughly around 4 million cases, at least in the next, maybe by September 12th or 15th, depending on the kind of doubling time. And the good thing, Karan, is the number of cases, if we look at both in terms of test positivity And the increase in the mortality, if you plot that as a growth rate, we are decreasing in the last 7-day moving average or the last 30-day moving average. So therefore, these estimates will vary depending on how the infection will spread out to the rest of the states and how the states will contain it.
Professor Babu, you used the word cases, and you said that we would have something like 4 million cases by the 12th, 15th of September. Move away from cases to infections, which includes not just the cases that are officially recorded, but also the infections that are not recorded. What do you believe will be the total of cases and infections 2 months from today on Diwali?
Now, in terms of the total number of infections, if you compare the global data, it roughly varies between 1 to 20 or 1 to 40. Let me explain. For every reported case, even in countries like United Kingdom, there are 40 infections based on their own seroprevalence data. So therefore, if it is between 20 to 40, looking at the kind of infections we have, we might be roughly around at least 10 times more than the number of reported cases will be the number of infections. And that too will be depending on how the rest of the states which have not peaked will
I
peak.
understand that, sir. I'm interrupting you. On that basis, that the total number of infections is 10 times more than cases. Although you did say that for Europe and America, it's sometimes 20 and 40 times more. You're deliberately scaling it down for India. I'm just pointing that out. But even at that scale down level, what will be the total number of cases and infections on Diwali? Remember, that's November the 14th, roughly 3 months away.
So I'll be wrong to project for Diwali for simply, I am only looking at 2 incubations period at a time. And beyond that, it's very difficult because if you look at how it panned out in both Mumbai and Delhi, I will say I will probably limit only till September. And once we reassess
When in
these numbers
September?
in
Are you
September,
talking about middle of September or end of September? Two
yeah,
incubation
by,
period means what?
that will
2 weeks
be
each?
mid of 2 incubations for, periods of 14 days each will be around 28 days. That will be roughly around mid September.
And you expect 4 million cases, which means 40
Yeah.
million infections if you multiply by 10. But if you
Yes.
multiply by the upper range, which is 40, 40 times 4 is huge. 40 times 4
Now,
is 160 million.
now these are simply guesstimates, correct? In terms of how, what kind of the upper range of these infections are going to be. Unless we do a second round of national seroprevalence survey, we will not be able to determine the exact number of infections. The one we did was in the end of April. So now this week, ICMR is starting the second round of national seroprevalence survey. That would exactly give us what will be the infection to case ratio. And if that's going to be 1:10, then probably we should be only looking at those number of cases.
Okay, you mentioned the need to do a second round of the National Seroprevalence Survey. Let's for a moment look at that first round. The first round captured the picture as per the end of April, and it showed that as per the end of April, 0.73% of the population had been exposed to the virus, and 0.73% is 10 million people. 3.5 months later, that is the time difference between end of April and now, and at India's doubling rate of 22 days, that suggests that a total of 320 million infections exist. That's a straight linear projection I've taken.
Yeah, so the first round of ICMR seroprevalence survey was done in adults. So therefore, if you were to extrapolate to that to number of infections, it will be roughly around 6.5 million infections. And then looking at the kind of estimates from the first round till now, we will have to account for how it has spread out to different areas, especially the population density is the most important determining factor in terms of what proportion of people might have got infected. But as I said earlier, the second round of seroprevalence survey will only tell us the exact number of infections. I wouldn't want to guesstimate for simple reason that we don't know what is the lower limit and upper limit of these guesstimates based on the evidence, at least in India.
I
Just to
understand.
give you,
So just to sum up, you believe that by the middle of September, that is the end of 2 incubation periods, each incubation period being 14 days, at the end of 28 days, you believe India will have 4 million cases. You believe it could have a total of 40 million infections. That's calculated on the belief that infections are 10 times more than cases. You're deliberately disregarding what you yourself said could be the case in Europe and America, where infections could be sometimes 20 times cases, sometimes 40 times cases. You're scaling it down to just 10. I'm only pointing that out for the audience. Let's move on.
the,
Do you have any sense when India is likely to peak? Or given that we're a subcontinental sized country, will different regions peak at different times?
I would look at what's happening in Delhi and Mumbai. And if you look at the average number of cases per day after they had nearly 23% seroprevalence in Delhi, it's around 1100 cases, around 1000 cases every day, which means that even after we reach some reasonable proportion, depending on the density again, we will continue to have a plateau. So my belief is that there will not be a single peak for India, given that the last 7 days and last 30-day moving average is going down for both test positivity and mortality rate. We might be in the early phase of deceleration, and therefore at the national level, and it is unfair to look at the national level because each state is behaving in a different way temporally, and also how it is testing, how it is implementing the interventions. Therefore, there will be a plateau for some time, after which it will go down. And I believe for some reason that because of the decrease in the 7 day and 30-day moving averages, we might have just entered the plateau now. I'll be happy to prove wrong if it started decreasing, but then the plateau is going to continue for some time at this kind, because already the doubling time is increasing, the fatality growth rate is decreasing, which is a good sign.
Yes, but the number of cases is increasing every single day. I know it's not always the same, but 3 days ago we were at 67,000, the highest we've been. Then we came down to 58, 59. Then we went back to 62. So maybe the number of deaths is plateauing and diminishing very slowly if you look at the weekly average. But the number of cases is not plateauing. That seems to be rising.
The counterfactuals are more important, Karan, here. By that, what I mean is, what would have happened if it were to be an exponential growth in cases? Then 67,000 cases today should have become at least twice in the next week or from few days from now. If that's not happening, if it is coming around the same numbers,
But Mr.
that means
Sir,
we are
if 67,000 is to become twice in the next couple of days, you're talking of a doubling rate of 2 or 3 days.
absolutely. So if that
Our doubling rate has
counterfactual,
moved in the last 3 months from 20 to 25. It's not a huge improvement in the doubling rate. It's only gone from 20 to 25. So roughly
I think
25 days later, we could have doubled yet again. So what gives you the feeling that the weekly average of cases is actually plateauing? When you look at it in the papers, it's distinctly rising.
so the absolute number of cases are probably increasing or staying the same, mainly on a linear scale. When you look at the test positivity growth rate, it's actually starting to go down, even the last 7 days or the last 30 days moving average. That's the initial sign to tell that probably the total number of cases that are going to be out there might be on a plateauing phase, if not decelerating right now.
Let me then pick up on the good news that you gave, even though many will question it. I won't question it any further. I've done that sufficiently already. I just re-emphasize the good news. You're saying that if you look at the weekly average of cases as well as deaths, you believe it's plateauing, if not decelerating. And that you believe is the first sign of good news. Am I right?
Yeah, just let me repeat it. The 7 day moving average of test positivity and the 7 day moving average of fatality is going down, which is the first sign of plateauing. That probably will be the better summary.
Even if the 7-day moving average of cases is not going down. 2 are going
Absolutely.
down, test positivity is going down, fatalities is going down, but the number of cases is not. Even so, you believe it's good news.
Yeah, I'll make another explanation here. In fact, if we have to decrease the test positivity and fatality, we ought to increase the number of cases that we detect. So, mere increase in number of cases, because even when asymptomatic are tested positive, it is better to find as many cases as possible so that we are containing the transmission. And that's the only way to reduce the test positivity and even fatalities, because you are giving early care.
So, in fact, you're now saying, if I understood you correctly, and I'm putting it in layman's terms, the increasing number of cases, including the increasing rate of the increasing cases, is not necessarily bad news, because it's the only way we can discover the total number of cases and bring the test positivity down. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Let
me put to you a question that many people are a bit flummoxed by. We have 2.6 million cases. We're increasing by an average of about 62,000 a day. Our rate of increase is now the greatest in any country. It's greater than America, it's greater than Brazil. And yet, the Indian government repeatedly insists we are not in community transmission. What's your opinion? Are we or are we not? Give me a clear answer.
Yeah. So this is a tough question to answer. I'll give a clear answer on this. It is unfair to look India as one unit and then say whether community transmission is present or absent. But if the question is, are different states are in different stages of transmission? Absolutely yes. As Mumbai and Delhi witnessed community transmission? Absolutely yes. But then is the entire country in community transmission phase? That's probably not correct, because by the government of India's guidelines, there are two different types of transmission that we are seeing in India now. One is local outbreak, which is amenable to containment. The next step is widespread outbreaks, which are not amenable to containment. So even the community transmission phrase, even though it is not there in the guideline, is subsumed within local outbreaks, which are amenable to containment.
Can I interrupt?
Just give.
Go ahead, finish.
Just give me a minute. Yeah. So according to the World Health Organization, the definition of community transmission is when you are no longer able to determine the source of infection, then you can call that as community transmission. But for that, we'll have to come to definition of how many number of cases per million. If we cannot trace the source of infection, then we can call it as community transmission.
Forgive me, Professor Babu, now like a politician playing with words rather than an epidemiologist. I don't mean to be harsh, but I'm being factual. Are you seriously telling me that we can trace the source of infection of each of the 60, 61, 62,000 new cases every day? Kerala is admitting it cannot trace the source of even 1,300, 1,400 new cases each day. The government officially admits it. It's hard to believe that the central government can claim that we could trace the source of 61, 62,000 new admissions every day. It's just simply hard to believe it.
No, I'm not saying there is no community transmission. I've just about
you came very close to saying it. Forgive me. You came very close to saying there's no community transmission.
No. I'll repeat what I said. There are different states in different stages of transmission, and there are large cities which have already surpassed the phase of community transmission, whereas the tier 2 and tier 3 cities are still in local circulation. As a country, we should not be able to define for the entire country whether we are in community transmission or not. You are absolutely right. We can't trace the source of infection for nearly more than 50% of the cases.
Forgive me, I'm interrupting you again on purpose. You said, and I'm repeating your words, that the definition of community transmission put out by the WHO is when you cannot trace the source of transmission. You've just said we cannot trace the source of transmission of 50% of cases. That means we're in community transmission, and yet you won't accept it. And your logic, that because of the size of the country, you can't claim it as community transmission, then America is an even bigger country. And Brazil in size is bigger. So there too you can't trace it, and therefore again community transmission does apply. In other words, you're so defining the term that you're making it meaningless. It seems to me
No, no,
you have
absolutely.
a reluctance to
No,
accept it.
no, absolutely not. I'm again saying there are cities which are in community transmission. There are states which are in community transmission. We will not be able to say that the entire country and every part of the country is in community transmission. This is what I meant when I was trying to explain all these terms.
All right. At least we've achieved something. There are cities, there are states, not just cities, but states that are in community transmission. The government won't even admit that, but you accepted there are both cities and states that are in community transmission. One more question, and this is again something that people are concerned about. India is a population of 1.38 billion, yet we're only testing, as of this morning, 22,393 per million. 22,393 per million. Given the size of our population, is that sufficient? If it's not, how much more would you like it to be? And secondly, are we testing the right sort of people, or do we need to rethink our testing strategy? Can you answer both for me?
Absolutely. So, from what we have been testing in the beginning of the pandemic till now, we have come a long way. This number of 20,000 plus per million is definitely needs to scale up. And if you look at the countries which have more than 100,000 cases, they're testing roughly around 50,000 plus per million. So there is scope for at least to test twice the number in the immediate time frame that we are looking at. In addition, as you also asked the other part of the question, which is very important that we need to consider, it is not just merely increasing in number of tests, but whom do we test and what tests do we employ, and then what kind of protocols that we use. I'll just give you explanation for the latter part of the answer. So if you follow the syndromic approach and then increase the number of tests, we will be detecting more number of cases which are more likely to spread to others. And in addition, if you are using rapid antigen test, for all the symptomatic tested negative on rapid antigen, we should be doing RT-PCR. Like Tamil Nadu is doing RT-PCR for all the suspect cases. So that is important. Testing the right people and using the test in the right manner, both are important in addition to increasing the number of tests.
So you're saying with regard to the sort of people we should be testing, we should be doing it syndromically. Secondly, you're saying everyone who is negative in an antigen test must be tested with the RT-PCR. At the moment, the only people who are negative who are tested are people who are symptomatic. You're saying regardless of whether they're symptomatic or not, if they've tested negative in an antigen test, they must be tested with the RT-PCR.
Just a correction there, Karan. I said all the symptomatics who are tested negative on the rapid antigen should be tested RT-PCR.
But that's already been done. But that's already been done. That's no different to what the government is doing. So how are you suggesting something different? That is the ICMR guideline.
No. Yeah, you're right that that's the ICMR guideline, but the states are not strictly implementing it. And that's why we are missing some areas of transmission. Especially in the Delhi, in the earlier part, this was not followed. So I think every state should uniformly implement that protocol.
Can I ask you this? Why should everyone who's tested negative through the antigen test not be immediately tested again through the RT-PCR process? Because we know that there are a very large percentage of false negatives from the antigen procedure. So regardless of whether you have symptoms or not, why not be tested? Because many of them could be asymptomatic and they could be carrying on the infection and passing it to others. So why shouldn't everyone who's tested negative in the antigen process be tested again through the RT-PCR process?
I think we'll have to do some pilot studies for that. And one of the zero prevalence surveys that we are planning to do, we want to exactly do this and then see what proportion of asymptomatics tested on rapid antigen test will then turn positive on RT-PCR. So if we have that initial data, I think we can look at suggesting to the government in terms of scaling up and also changing the testing strategy.
Okay, so far, Professor Babu, we've talked about the big picture facing the country. It's worrying. The only silver lining, as I said in the introduction, is in fact the low mortality rate. Let's now come to that silver lining, the low mortality rate, and let's try and establish just how much of comfort and reassurance it is. As of this morning, India's mortality rate is 38 per million. The first question, as I said a moment ago, is how accurate is this mortality rate? In an article that you wrote for The Hindu on the 14th of August, you said 86% of all deaths get registered. Now that percentage, 86, is hugely reassuring, but how confident are you of that 86% figure?
So the 86% comes from the Department of Civil Registry and also the vital statistics. And this is a government report hosted on the public domain. And there are death audits done, especially in the verbal autopsies, which establish that some states have done well, some states have not done well. But 86% is an accurate figure in terms of registration. However, what is not accurate
I'll stop you there. I'll come to what you want to hint at, which is whether these deaths are certified by a doctor. But this 86% figure of registration also applies to rural India. You are saying to me that on average across the country, both urban and rural, 86% of all deaths are registered. You're saying that?
No, since it's an average, some states will definitely not do really well, but urban and rural areas in some states have 100% registration, such as Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and this is based on the state figure because at least in matters of inheritance, the death registration is compulsory. Therefore, there is an active effort by the state governments to improve the registration. And I believe these numbers in states which have 100%, because in that case, we just have to find a death which is not registered. And so far, I don't see any research which says that that's not the case.
All right. So the 86% figure is a national average. It combines good performing states and bad performing states. It also combines rural India and urban India. On average, in India as a nation, 86% of deaths are registered. The problem, and this is the point you were about to make, the problem is that only 22% of deaths are medically certified by a doctor. In some states, it's actually just 10%. In UP, it's 5%. In Bihar, it's 2.4%. Now, if such a large percentage of deaths are not certified by a doctor, doesn't it mean that a lot of COVID deaths are not being certified as COVID deaths?
Okay, so here there are two things. I'll come to the COVID death reporting first. The COVID death reporting is not happening mostly through the civil registration system, which goes into the municipalities and corporations, and then we are taking. But a parallel system is created where every COVID-19 case is registered in ICMR portal, and the death data directly goes to National Centers for Disease Classification. So there are two parallel systems.
No, forgive me. I hate interrupting you, but what you're saying can only happen if COVID deaths happen in COVID care centers or hospitals.
Absolutely.
There is a paper written just 4 days before yours in The Hindu by Hemant Shivade and Giridhar Gopal. They wrote their paper on the 10th. You wrote your paper on the 14th. They say, and I'm quoting them, suspected COVID-19 deaths occurring at home or during transit or in non-COVID hospitals may not be reported. Outside designated COVID-19 facilities, there could be many instances of suspected COVID-19 being the cause of death, which may not be captured. And they add, this may be more pronounced in rural and semi-urban areas where there is poor access to health facilities or to qualified doctors. In other words, there are many areas and spaces where COVID deaths could be happening, which are not recognized as COVID deaths, and therefore, what we believe is the COVID mortality rate may be inaccurate. It may be hugely undercounted.
I will begin by saying that there might be some undercounting of deaths, but if you look at any person having death, even in urban areas or rural areas, and if they have symptoms, and I can assure you, Karan, that the rural health system through ASHAs and auxiliary nurse midwife is more robust than the lack of manpower in urban areas. We would know whether there is a death or not. If it is due to COVID or not, that's a certification process which has to be done. The primary health centers are already trained in assessing whether it is COVID related or not. So therefore, we cannot simply miss. There might be a delay in reconciliation of the data, but then we simply cannot miss that many deaths due to COVID which are missed outside the system. So
Can
therefore,
I,
I believe there
can I
might,
repeat what you
yeah,
said? Because I think it's important the audience should understand. You began by saying that the rural health system, particularly through the ASHA network, is at times more robust, than in urban India. As a result of which, there may be some delay in recognizing COVID deaths, but they will not be missed. They will be reconciled.
absolutely,
You really believe
absolutely.
that rural
Abs-
India has this robust system? Because many people believe in rural India, when COVID deaths happen, they will not be recognized. The last rites will be performed without any medication or medical certification.
No, it's a well-known evidence. Based on the evidence, we know all the urban areas do not have health manpower. Therefore, we don't track house to house. In fact, in urban areas, people don't know who the neighbors also are. But in rural areas, a ASHA worker caters to 1,000 people. A ANM does that for 5,000 people. So if there is a death, they will bring to the attention of the health system. It's most unlikely to be missed that the death has occurred, especially during COVID time, that they have not recognized this. In an area where there are no ASHAs, no ANMs, then it is a possibility. But those kind of areas are very, very few in this entire country.
You said it is most unlikely that a COVID death will be missed in rural areas because of the fact that ASHAs cover 1,000 people per person. Let me go back to that article which appeared in the Hindu just 4 days before yours on the 10th of August by Giridhar Gopal and Hemant Shevade. They claim that COVID deaths are being underreported by a factor of 5.29. They estimate that the July 31 mortality figure of 35,747 actually should have been 1,88,938. In other words, over 150,000 COVID deaths they believe had happened as of July the 31st, which were not accounted for. Now, I know and I accept and I concede that theirs is an extrapolation. But if they're even halfway close to the truth, they're putting India's death rate pretty close to American levels.
Yeah, so I have looked at their methodology. They have looked at medical registration and then how that can play a role in terms of understanding how big the underestimate can be. That's one of the methodologies which they have chosen. The other better and superior methodology will be doing verbal autopsy. The third option will be doing death audits, which are being currently done in states to understand what is the cause of death. So we will have to resort to all these methods because we do not have a robust system which captures the cause of death. So they are compelled to use a estimate, and I do not necessarily believe whether one estimate would be better than the others unless I am given the data to prove, or there is an evidence to say that indeed we have missed by these many times. In the absence of evidence, anybody's estimate can be as good as their methodology.
But now you said something that contradicts what you said earlier. Your words now, when I'm quoting you, we don't have a robust system which captures the cause of death. In which case,
Yeah.
you neither know for certain whether you've missed COVID deaths, nor do you know for certain that this is a COVID death. In other words,
Now
we just don't know. So you could be right in saying we're not missing COVID deaths or we're missing only very few, but they could be right in saying we're missing an awful lot. The problem is if we don't have a robust system which captures cause of death, it works both ways.
let me explain what I said earlier. Since an ASHA knows how many deaths are, it is reported in the routine system. What we now need is death audits. What we now need is verbal autopsies to ascertain whether it is due to COVID or not. This should occur at a national scale, not just few states doing it. Only then we will be able to reconcile the data. So it's not hidden, it is known. Whether the attribution to COVID or not, that we have to ascertain by doing superior methodologies than estimating it. Otherwise, we all can estimate and none of us can be
But
right, as you correctly said.
now that you stress the need for death audits, and you yourself say that all we're doing is estimating, you're also conceding that the mortality rate of 38 per million is an estimate. It's not a fact that we can stand up and totally support. You said it yourself. It's an estimate. It needs to be audited through death audits. And let me finish, and then you answer. One reason why people are skeptical is we've had fairly good reports from burial grounds and crematoriums in Delhi, and similarly from Bombay, where the number of people being cremated or buried in COVID protocols is much higher than the official figure for COVID deaths in Delhi or Bombay. They were reconciled later on, I don't deny it, but they were only reconciled after the difference was pointed out. And if differences are not pointed out, then the reconciliation won't happen. And that means that there are good grounds for Gopal and Shevade claiming that we are undercounting, maybe not by a factor of 5.29, which may be too big, but we're undercounting perhaps by a factor of 3 or 4 or even 2.
Yeah, so in fact, I began my answer saying that there may be undercounting. We just don't know what is the extent to which undercounting. Therefore, we should be looking at death audits. And you are right. And in the same article that you quoted about Hindu, which I wrote 4 days later, I said, in the absence of evidence from burial grounds or any in your own community neighborhood, we should be looking at where the evidence is coming from. So I was looking at the data in Bangalore to give you an example. If there are deaths that are occurring 4,000 every month in a city like Bangalore, now what is the total number of deaths and what is the excess deaths? And as I said earlier, no death can be hidden, especially if it is related to COVID-19. People just cannot hide it. The civil society is strong, media is strong, and social media is strong.
Forgive me. Social society and media and civil society are strong in urban India. 66% of your country live in rural India. I'm not so sure about how effectively or deeply social media has infiltrated rural India. And in rural India, if people fall ill and are not diagnosed as COVID, they could die and they could be buried or cremated without any protocols or sign, and that death will be missed. It's only in burial grounds of Delhi and Bombay where COVID protocols were followed that you realize these were COVID deaths, and therefore you discover the government hasn't accounted for them. But if people are buried ordinarily in rural India without COVID protocols, having fallen ill, you don't know whether they've died of COVID or not. And that's why I want to repeat what you said a moment ago. You said we may be undercounting. We don't know the extent of undercounting. So now you're conceding that the 38 per million death from COVID, which is the figure as of this morning, could be slightly wrong, it could be majorly wrong, it could be completely wrong. We just don't know because we don't know the extent of undercounting.
No, based on whatever I have looked at the evidence, I don't see that this is majorly wrong. The undercounting might be, by the factor of 1 or 2, but not much beyond that. And this is again my guesstimate. So now we have guesstimates which have to be validated by the real data through the reconciliation.
But Professor Babu, if we're undercounting by a factor of 2, that means we're undercounting by 100%.
No, I'll just give you an example. Let me explain.
Doesn't it? If we're undercounting by a factor of 2, that's undercounting by 100%.
No, 100% in terms of percentage, but let me explain. Delhi has more than 200 deaths per million as of today. Mumbai has more than 200. Eventually, all major cities will have this because only the numerator keeps changing. The population denominator is same. Once the reconciliation occurs throughout the country, we will know the exact number. But I do not simply know as of today what is the factor. And I said it may be less than what Hemant and Giridhar have said, but not nearly as much as 5 times. In that case, we would have seen deaths in our own community, in every neighborhood.
I'm going to end this particular section by quoting from your own article. You say deaths cannot be hidden in the case of COVID-19. Sooner or later, they get reported due to vigilant media and an active civil society. It's in all our interest to accept your point that there is no major undercounting, but I'll simply repeat that you believe we don't know the extent of the undercounting, and that's worrying. And I'll also repeat that there are some areas where, in fact, doctor certification of death is as little as 2% or 5%. 2% in the case of Bihar, 5% in the case of UP. Nationally, doctors only certify 22% of death. But we've quarreled enough about this, and I've done it on purpose because we will only establish the point I want to go on to make once we've clarified that there is reasonable honesty behind the mortality rate from COVID in India. Let's accept your argument that there is reasonable honesty. Then let's come to the critical question. Why is India's mortality rate so different compared to other countries? As I said, as of this morning, our rate is 38 per million. As of this morning, UK is 609 per million. Spain is 613. Italy is 586. How do you explain the huge differences between 38 per million and 613 per million?
So to begin with, Delhi's 200 plus per million is comparable, but at much lower scale compared to the rest of the developed nations. But India is not alone. There are other countries who share the same stories of low death mortality, our South Asian neighbors and some in Africa. And there are some reasons which are, if you look at the median age in India, which is roughly around 29 years, this is much younger compared to the 40 plus or 45 plus median age of the people in the West. The second thing seems to be cross immunity that might have come through the immunity through other types of beta coronaviruses, which might cause common cold and other diseases. And therefore, we might have some kind of immune response that is better to tolerate the disease compared to the people in the West. There are also some signs which indicate that maybe because there is some, the dose of the virus that enters our body. So for example, the implementation of the mask or physical distancing, if it was done well in the beginning, it would not go because the mask will probably prevent the dose, viral dose, which enters the body in the initial dose. There's also some theory which says maybe genetically we are different from others, and some of the hypotheses are in terms of ABO blood group and the kind of genetic susceptibility Asians and Africans have might be different compared to what they have in the West. So these are all hypotheses at this stage. We need to further examine which one might be the actual reason. I think there's a great role for T-cell immunity under the cross immunity, which is less explored as of today, but the recent evidence suggests that we might be protected because of these innate responses.
So just to sum up for the audience, you said there are 4 or 5 different hypotheses which could explain why the mortality rate in India is so vastly different to the mortality rate in countries like UK, Spain, and Italy. First, the age profile. Our median age is 28, 29. The median age in Europe tends to be 45, 46, 47. Secondly, Indians have been subjected to a much greater number of infections and viruses, so we may have an innate immunity, which Europe and Americans don't have. Thirdly, there is a possibility of a genetic factor. We don't know, it's just a possibility. And then there was a fourth, which I didn't fully understand, and I want you to repeat and explain. It's to do with the wearing of masks, which you said shut the doors to the virus, if I heard you correctly.
Yeah, so there's some evidence. They've compared Diamond Princess cruise ship with the other, where they saw in the later on, wherever in the closed spaces there is cross infection, people who were wearing masks, including some of the early evidence from of the schools and also the barber shops, for example, where people are using the masks, the amount of virus that enters, the initial viral entry dose, inoculation dose, determines how much more people will get infected and how severe they'll implement. So the countries who are relatively well off in early nationwide lockdown and better use of better use of masks and physical distancing might have shown lower mortality, but that evidence is just emerging. We'll have to examine how true the overall evidence plays out.
Except you brought up this hypothesis about wearing masks which reduce the initial entry door to the virus in support of the fact that India has a lower death mortality. Actually, it should ensure that richer countries where masks are worn more often have a better advantage. Yet the advantage comes to India. Isn't that a bit odd?
Now, if you look at the stories from the United States, the compliance of mask is not that great compared to what has been done in India, and there is initial reluctance, but then by and large, you see most people wearing masks in public spaces in India compared to the United States as of today.
All right, I'll accept that. There'll be many in the audience who wonder whether you're correct. I don't know whether everyone agrees that Indians have been diligent in wearing masks all the time. Many Indians wear it in a very strange way on their chin rather than covering their mouth and nose, but let's accept that point. One last question before I take a break. Could vitamin D have anything to do with the fact that the mortality rate in India, our neighbors, many African countries, even countries further afield like Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia, they have a much lower mortality rate than, say, Europe and America? Could vitamin D have a factor to play?
I have looked at the evidence of vitamin D. It's all over. It is, as of now, very inconclusive to suggest vitamin D is giving any advantage to the South Asians or even the Africans for that matter. And our cutoff levels for vitamin D deficiency are by the Western standards. And we have a really high vitamin D deficiency, even in India, by their standards. So I'm not completely convinced, at least looking at the data in terms of vitamin D yet.
Professor Babu, let's take a break at that point. When I come back in much shorter time than we've spent in part one, I want to talk to you about two critical issues. One, herd immunity, and related to that, Dr. Carl Friston's view of what he calls immunological dark matter. And secondly, the extent to which you get immunity from an infection and how long does it last. But first, a little break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is Professor of Epidemiology at the Public Health Foundation of India in Bangalore, Giridhar Babu. Professor Babu, let me now come to an issue on which epidemiologists differ. At what level of COVID-19 infection is herd immunity established? Some say it's 70%. Others put it at between 40 and 50. Some put it as low as 20%. What's your view?
So now, to determine the level for population immunity or herd immunity, what we take is R naught. R naught is nothing but the number of people whom one person give the infection to. So if COVID-19 has an R naught of 2.5, 1 divided by 2.5 will give roughly around 0.4, which is 40%. Once the virus reaches less than 40%, then the disease will contain. That means 60% of the people should have either got the vaccine or the infection to say that we have reached the population level of immunity.
So you believe that herd immunity will come into play when 60% of the population have got the virus. Is that right?
The 60% of the people have got immunity, not the virus. The immunity can mainly come from either the vaccine or any type of immune mechanism, which includes the natural immunity coming from the virus or the T cell immunity or the beta cell immunity, whatever the immune response is. The moment we touch that 60%, then the total disease transmission should start tapering down.
you added in that list of things the T cell immunity, and that draws me to the Dr. Carl Friston view of what he calls immunological dark matter. He's a neuroscientist at University College London. He's now become pretty well known. He argues that 50% of any population is not susceptible to any virus because of such things as cross immunity as well as geographical isolation. Do you believe that view has credence? And if it does, is it not possible that it could drop the threshold at which herd immunity becomes effective to something like 25-30%?
So I have watched Professor Carl Friston say the term immunological dark matter. He didn't prefer; it was editorial ingenuity. However, he explained that it is possible that most people get immunity through unknown mechanisms, and that's where I bring in the possibility of T cell immunity and the other in terms of even clinical and asymptomatic infections. Together put, if you do a seroprevalence, if you are getting maybe around 40% of seroprevalence and then combine it with the T cell responses, you might have reached the 60% cutoff. So somewhere between 25 to 40% is what the seroprevalence we should be looking at to achieve the overall immunity protection at 60%.
It's very interesting you should say that we should be looking at somewhere around 20-25% of seroprevalence, because the recent seroprevalence survey done in Delhi, and you referred to it earlier yourself in part one, shows that 23.6% of the population has been exposed to the virus. But the interesting thing, and I want to underline this, the interesting thing is that instead of galloping to infect the remaining 77%, the disease has in fact started plateauing in Delhi. And as you mentioned, for 32 days, the increase is somewhere between 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 cases a day. Or to put it differently, for 32 days, the increase has been under 1,500 a day. Do you get the feeling, I know it's only a hunch, do you get the feeling that a combination of Dr. Friston's immunological dark matter and seroprevalence is building towards some sort of herd immunity in Delhi? Is that why Delhi is plateauing?
So, as of yesterday, they did the second round of Delhi seroprevalence, and the initial findings show that there has been increase only in 3% compared to the previous estimate.
No, forgive me. I'm quoting the Hindu, and the Hindu today reports that in fact the seroprevalence for the city is now 29%. That's an increase of 6%, and some districts say it may be as high as 31%. But the overall average figure for the city, according to the Hindu reporting today, is 29%. That's an increase of 6% in a month.
Yeah, I stand corrected. So if it is 6%, then what we are seeing is not the rest of like 60% getting immunity immediately. But then I agree to your explanation that we may not be looking at 60% through the seroprevalence. We might be reaching maybe around 40% as the upper limit. But there is the possibility of T cell immunity, which is also known probably as immunological dark matter, which will have its role in the overall population immunity.
Very interesting. So in its own way, Delhi could be, I emphasize the word could be moving towards suggesting that Dr. Friston's theory has a lot of credibility. Let me raise the final issue with you. It's to do with how much immunity do you believe someone gets after they've been infected by the virus? I noticed that just a couple of days ago, the United States Center for Disease Control says that it will last at least 3 months. But 3 months is not very long.
So I have looked at what the Centers for Disease Classification says, but there are at least one paper I saw in the preprint, which is not peer reviewed yet, which suggests that these are as long as 6 months, because given the entire history of this pandemic is not that long, we can only keep counting till how long we can find this immune response. So far, it doesn't suggest that it will disappear just like that. Till 6 months, there is a possibility of this immunity staying on.
Let me point out that King's College London also did a study which shows that in fact the immunity from antibodies as a result of infection may not be more than 4 months. So it's not a very long immunity, even if it's 6 months, as you suggest. Does this have implications for a vaccine? Does it suggest that the vaccine's effect may not last even for a full year? That, like the flu vaccine, we may have to have an injection every single year?
So, compared to flu, the virus causing the pandemic is relatively stable. There are not major mutations possibility in the future. So, therefore, I don't see the possibility of looking at that. But what we definitely need to know is we need to study how long the antibody mediated, the neutralizing antibody mediated immunity lasts. How long does the T cell mediated immunity last? Because what a vaccine or a virus is supposed to act in both ways, and the antigen presenting cell within the body is T lymphocytes and macrophages. We need to be looking at other types of immune mechanisms to understand how long the protection is before we can say anything about whether vaccines will be beneficial or not.
When you say we need to look at other types of immunization that we have, that raises this question, and this has to be my last question, whether the antibody immunity that you get from an infection is stronger than the T cell immunity that we all carry within us. There's a debate about that, and many people are coming to the conclusion that T cell immunity may be our best defense. Very quickly, do you have a view on that debate?
So the evidence regarding T cell mediated immunity is emerging now. There is encouraging news that the T cell mediated response is also a possibility. So together with neutralizing antibody, which is very specific to the antigens of the virus, and non-neutralizing antibody, which is non-specific, and T cell mediated response, I think we need to study all these immune mechanisms further to understand how long is the overall protection offered by the vaccine or the virus, and then take a call based on the evidence.
But you seem to be suggesting that, in fact, the T cell immunity, particularly memory T cells that get activated because they built up immunity to some other coronavirus in the past, may be one of our best defenses.
Absolutely. I think that might be one of the reasons why most South Asians do not have severe illness, at least in the young age group, and also probably why we have lower mortality as well.
Well, let's end on a humorous note. As you say, that may be one reason why most South Asians do not fall seriously ill. And that suggests, and I'm putting it deliberately, flippantly, thank God we've been prone to other infections and other viruses. Just when we needed it, it's given us protection against the worst of them all, COVID-19. There's something to be said for the unhealthy conditions in which we've all lived and grown up. On that humorous note, I thank you, Professor Babu, for this interview, for making time for us. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.